So I think we can slowly begin, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our series, The Story of the Other. So in this series, we intend to examine how other protests or other social movements or other political movements or what have you have evolved to different circumstances, what we can learn from these experiences as a student movement, and how we can increase dialogue between different political movements and other views and try to learn from these experiences. So what another person or what another movement starts than with DM and with Professor Varoufakis. As you all know, Varoufakis is currently the champion of pan-European, also global cooperation, in my humble opinion. After the economic crisis in Europe, the Euro crisis, where Professor Varoufakis has been very vocal about what has been happening in Europe in terms of the power relations between European institutions and countries. He has written books about these, and also he has co-founded the movement, Democracy in Europe movement, and also he's the leader of the Mera 25 party in Greece. And we will talk about how these movements started and what we can learn from this. And I will leave the floor to Professor Varoufakis to make some introductory remarks. Professor Varoufakis, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Özgür. Thank you, everyone. My greetings to students, staff, friends at Boğaziçi University, other universities in Istanbul, across Turkey. Look, I'm not here to enlighten you. Everybody's experiences are different and equally valid. And even though there is commonality in many respects, at the same time, every struggle is different and needs to be understood as such. The one thing I bring possibly to this conversation is, firstly, that yes, I have been involved in what is supposed to be a civilized clash, political clash within a union of democracies, that is the European Union. But at the same time, I carry with me a pre-European Union history, in the sense that I grew up in a right-wing dictatorship next door to Turkey. At the time when you had your own dictatorships, or you were about to have them. We came first, I think, then you came, you followed, or anyway, it doesn't really matter. We oscillated between different dictatorships. So let me share, just to begin with, to kickstart, and then we can have this discussion between us. I want to relate to you as a first-year student in England, 1978. I arrived in England. I was very glad to be there. Like all young people, it was good to escape home, to end up on my own and having to fend for myself and being involved in all sorts of interesting things, from music festivals to students' union meetings to trades union activities. It was a time when it was a winter of discontent, as the English say it. So there was in 1979, a major clash between the trades unions movement and the Labour Party at the time, that was in government under James Callaghan, the Prime Minister. It was a clash between the Labour Party and the trades unions that supposedly owned the Labour Party. But very soon after that, because of this clash, Margaret Thatcher, who was leading the Conservative Party, capitalized on this strife between the Labour movement and the Labour Party, and won government in April of 1979. And I remember being in one of the first picket lines in a trades union strike of steel workers against the Thatcher government's attempt to privatize and to shut down the steel workers. Now, why am I telling you that? Because this is, my first experience as a student, first-year student, very young person living in Britain, carrying my, Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experience with me, which I'm sure is very similar to yours. And there I am on a picket line having this conversation with trades unionists, trades unionists from Yorkshire. I could hardly understand what he was saying in that Geordie accent. But the conversation was very enlightening to me because, I was enthusiastic being there, and having escaped the Near East the Ottoman Empire, to put it that way, because let's face it, we are all part of the Ottoman Empire. You in Turkey, we in Greece, or what? No, descendants of the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Roman Empire. This whole thing that binds our fates together. And I was telling the British English trade unionists that because he was complaining about the lack of democracy, the lack of accountability of government, the way in which the little people were being trampled upon, and I said to him, at least you don't have fascism. At least you don't fear the secret police breaking down your door in the middle of the night and spiriting you away. You have democracy, you have liberalism, you have rights, freedom of expression. He said, you know what, mate? That's all true. But if democracy could change things, it would be banned in this country. So I think that's a good way of beginning. I have no doubt that being Boğaziçi, wherever you are in Turkey, given the circumstances that are quite dire, which you're facing, you're looking to us in the European Union and you're thinking, oh, at least they have freedoms, which is true. At least they have democracy in the sense that, we have elections that are not totally rigged. But I tell you, democracy has been banned in the European Union a long time ago, but in such a subtle way that no one noticed. And the question is, what's worse? A democracy that is banned or effectively eradicated or neutered in a subtle way so that nobody realizes it, or people like your good selves living in an authoritarian regime and seeing the authoritarianism around you, the visible enemy sometimes is much easier to defeat or to struggle with than the invisible one. That's the way I want to start this conversation before we get down to the nitty-gritty of resistance to authoritarianism, of movements, of freedom of expression, and so on.
I think that was a brilliant way to start. And I want to ask the first question along the concluding remarks that you made. You mentioned how there was a subtle shift away from democracy and towards fascism. And I mentioned how it all actually began during the Euro crisis. So how did an economic crisis turn into a movement of democracy? How did you come to realize this shift towards subtle fascism?
Well, look, fascism emerges as a result of two forces working side by side. One is humiliation, when the majority of people are humiliated, either by military defeat or by a never-ending crisis that makes them beggars, either of authority or the employer. A depression, people losing their jobs, wages falling, pensions being depleted. This is, one of the two forces that leads to fascism. The second is when democratic institutions become clearly sidelined. And there are two ways of sidelining democratic institutions. One is to have a military coup. The army comes in, or the constitutional court, or what's happening in Hungary with Erdogan. We see it in India with Modi. The democratic institutions are effectively suppressed. Freedom of the press, newspapers, like in Hong Kong recently, closing down. That's the brutish way. But the way it happened in the European Union, it was even far more dangerous and subtle than that. What happened here was this. Ever since we created the European Union, and we didn't call it the European Union back in the 1950s, we called it the European Community of Coal and Steel, which is indicative. It was a union of big business, coal, steel. Then the automobile makers came in, the electrical goods suppliers came in, the large-scale farmers came in, the bankers came in. So it became a big business cartel. That was what the European Union was. And especially when we created the common currency, the euro. But we created it in a way that took away every single decision-making power from member states, from governments, from parliaments. Because if you take away monetary policy, who decides interest rates, the supply of money. If you take away from the democratic decision-making process and at the same time create constraints on what governments can spend and not spend, during a financial crisis like the one that hit the world in 2008, beginning in Wall Street, like they always do, and then migrating to Europe, then suddenly governments, even if you and me were in government, or God, or the angels, or whoever, divinity were to take over the government, they have no power. If you do not control money and you do not control fiscal policy, the capacity to tax and spend and borrow and all that, then it really doesn't matter whether you have formal democracy or not. The parliament is useless. And when this happens, all the power, all the decision making is transferred to Brussels, to the center of the European Union, to Frankfurt, where the European Central Bank is. But these centers are democracy-free zones. They were designed as democracy-free zones. They're not elected positions. There's no way we can get rid of them. We cannot vote them out. And it's not that there is a lack or a deficit, a democratic deficit in those places. As I keep saying, people are astounded to hear me saying that. It's like saying that there is an oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen on the moon. It's very simple. It was not designed to have oxygen. Similarly, Brussels is not designed to have democracy. So, the crisis, creating this straitjacket, where monetary policy goes all to a center which is a democracy-free zone. Then a crisis hits, and every country becomes bankrupt. Every bank becomes bankrupt. So the governments cannot make any decision because the governments are bankrupt, the banks are bankrupt, and then you rely on the democracy-free zones in Frankfurt and Brussels to decide everything. And this affects the way people live lives everywhere. So take universities. I'll give you an example. In my university, University of Athens, if you exclude salaries, take salaries out because they're paid directly by the Ministry of Finance. The budget of my university, it's a very large university, University of Athens, 60,000 students, whatever. The total budget outside of salaries was 15 million euros at the beginning of the crisis. This was 2008, 2009, 2010 even. 53 million euros. Not that much for a large university, but that's what it was. 2 years later, do you know what it was? 3. It went from 53 to 3. That's the destruction of the university. Salaries went down by 40%. Yeah. So we could not retain good teachers because the salaries were already low by European standards, by American standards, by British standards. They were already less than half. So if you take another 40% out, people who can get jobs in Germany or in Britain or in the United States do so. So at that point, you could find yourself in a state where the institutions of democracy have not been touched. You still have freedom of the press. You can say anything you want. You can write anything in your blog. The secret police is not going to come and knock your door down. But so what? Because democracy requires not only a capacity to speak, but also a capacity to decide collectively. But if your parliament is neutered and, Brussels tells you if you don't want to be thrown out of the euro, you have to pass every piece of legislation that we email to you in English from Brussels and is translated by Google Translate, and then you have to pass it. And no member of parliament reads it, just passes it, because otherwise the ATMs will stop working. Now that's a dead colony with all the workings, all the machinery of democracy. So, friends in Turkey, I know what you're going through, but don't have a rose-tinted picture of what's going on in the European Union. Yes, it is better not to fear the police. It is better to be able to write an article and get it published on your website without anybody bothering you. It's fantastic. But that's not democracy.
So it seems to be that there has been a drain of power from the base or from the entirety of the population, and there has been a concentration of it for the financial sector, for the political sector, what have you. And in this climate, we have so much concentration of political power. and also much polarization in countries that are experiencing these autocratic transformations. How to bring these people together, how to reach these people, because it seems that the more we're trying to reach them, the more we're getting polarized. But there has to be a way that we can reach out to these people and say, you know what you're doing right now, politically, economically, and what have you, it's actually hurting you. And let me pose this question in a way that DM had a stream 1 week ago. Why is the left not good at winning public opinion?
Wow, that's a big question. Actually, three big questions wrapped up in one. Let me start by saying, how did we manage to bring people out and rebel back in 2015? Because we did it in 2015. It didn't work. The rebellion only lasted 6 months, and then it collapsed. But still, it was remarkable that it happened. Right? We won government. I was Minister of Finance, for goodness sake, right? So the way that happened was by having a progressive movement that was not anti-European, which was not saying, we have to get out of the European Union. It was not fascist. It was progressive. Because these crises give rise to fascism unless you have a progressive party or a progressive movement offering a progressive alternative to fascism. Because fascism is really very astute at taking advantage, at capitalizing on these collapses, the humiliation. Because all a strongman needs to do is get up on a pedestal, on a podium, and say, look at you in the eye and say, I'm going to make you proud again of being Turkish, being Greek, or being German, doesn't matter, being American, I'll make America great again. I'll make Turkey great again. I'll make Greece great again. It's very easy to say that. And just give me power. I'm going to eradicate all this riffraff. The foreigners, the refugees, the people who are different, the gays, those who want trade union power and democracy and all this blah, blah, blah, blah, which depletes the strength of the nation. This is what they say. So give me authority and I will look after you. And, they do. The fascists are good about it. They look after people in the sense they give them a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, some pensions and so on condition that the people shut up and follow the leader. That's fascism. You know it very well, right? You experience it. So what the only thing that can stop that is a progressive movement that is internationalist, that says our enemy is not the German, it's not the Turk, it's not the French, it is not the Italians, it's not the Americans. The enemy is the agglomeration, the alliance between bankers, big business, and those who benefit from turning the majority of the people in Greece against the majority of people in Turkey, against the majority of people in Germany, right? While the oligarchies are on very good terms and they are working together against the majorities everywhere. So this is what we tried to do in 2014, 2015. We ran government on that. And it shows that it works because we had a party of 4%, which went up to 40%. And then we had a referendum, and it's actually the anniversary on Monday of that referendum 6 years ago, when we went to 62%. 62% voted in favor of us against this oligarchy, this international oligarchy. Unfortunately, my colleagues in that government betrayed that referendum. And that was complete devastation, It's like, together we had arrived at the stream ready to drink, and it was taken away from us by our own people. So, the enemy often lies within, it's not outside. So we're doing it again. This time, after that referendum's betrayal by my colleagues, by the government that I was part of, some of us decided, look, this time we're not going to have just a Greek internationalist movement struggling. No, we will create a pan-European transnational movement, which is not Greek, which is not German, we call it DiEM25, Democracy in Europe movement. And the innovation behind DiEM25 is that it is transnational. It doesn't belong to one country. It's not an alliance of national parties. It's not a Greek party and a German party and a French party. No, it's one thing. We're in it as human beings, not as Greeks or Germans. We're human beings who happen to be Greek and very proud to be Greek, who happen to be German, very proud to be German. But together in this, we are one movement, one transnational movement. And this transnational movement created little parties in different countries, not in order to be an alliance of the parties, but because we had to contest elections. So Mera 25 means DM25 in Greek, and we are in Greece's parliament. So that was the idea. We have not been as successful as we wanted. We are in Greek parliament. We're not in the other parliaments yet. But we are trying to create a new way of doing left-wing politics, because you asked me what's wrong with the left. And I'll answer you the question in two ways. Firstly, the left has been too parochial and too nation-based, nation-state-based. Whether the Greek Communist Party or the Greek Socialist Party or Syriza, we have the Die Linke in Germany, we have Mélenchon in France, and so on. Each one of them coming up with a program of change in their own country, independently of the other programs, without a program for changing Europe. But since all the important decisions are made in Europe, you cannot really have a program which promises change at the level of the nation state without promising a change at the level of Europe. So you need a pan-European manifesto, a pan-European program, and then under that to have your Greek program, Italian program, and so on. So that's one reason why the left has failed. Because they made promises on the basis of national plans that could not be implemented without any European plan. So every time they got in government, like my colleagues in 2015, after I left, they didn't have a program for Europe. In the end, they said yes to everything that came from Brussels. So that was finito, finished. The second reason is that I think the left has failed to come to terms. And this is a more philosophical or political economy discussion, if you want. I think that the left is failing to come to terms with the way in which capitalism has been morphing, changing itself since 2008 into something completely different to what it used to be. I have been recently making a suggestion which is extremely controversial, and even I am sort of shocked by it, that capitalism has died now. It has already morphed into something else, it's a new variety of feudalism, technocratic feudalism. I call it techno-feudalism. And why is this related to the question of why is the left failing? Because the left has traditionally concentrated on what I could refer to as laborism, the right of everyone to a fair job, a fair wage, of everybody becoming a proletarian in a sense, full employment. We've been, struggling for this for years now, in a system that cannot create full employment anymore. And in a system where people actually don't want to be proletarians anymore, young people like yourself, you do not want to have a fair wage. And, it's really startling to me that the left has forgotten the lessons of Marx, because Karl was not interested in that. Karl was, if there's a little pamphlet that he wrote called Wages, Prices, and Profit, in which he attacks the concept of a fair wage. He says there can be no fair wage under capitalism. Every wage is exploitative, however large it is, because that's what the wage system does. So in any case, the left has failed to change capitalism. Let's not get into this now, 100 years of failure. But capitalism changed itself. The worst enemy of capitalism was capitalism, not the left. If you look at now how capitalism works, it's got nothing to do with the capitalism that any tradition of economic thinking described. Yes, there were many varieties of capitalism. Competitive capitalism, bakers and butchers and brewers competing with one another in small markets. There was the big business capital of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, big companies, conglomerates. That's the monopoly stage of capitalism, as Lenin or Rosa Luxemburg or Hobson described, or even Schumpeter from the right wing. Then there was financialized capitalism after the end of Bretton Woods in 1971, with the big banks and Wall Street effectively taking over most power from industrial capital, from the industrialists. These are all very great transformations of capitalism. But capitalism remains capitalism in all these things. And what makes capitalism capitalism in all these things is two things. First, that it was always, regardless of all these transformations, it remained a system driven by profit by private profit, either the baker, the brewer, the butcher, or Henry Ford, or later Goldman Sachs. It was driven by profit. That's one thing. And secondly, it was market-based. Exploitation was happening at the market. Exploitation of workers was happening in the labor market. So you employed somebody, you paid them the value of their labor time, but you kept from them the value of their labor, which was much greater. That's in typical Marxist terms. Consumers, you exploited them. If you had a monopoly, if you were the only seller of something, you exploited the consumer surplus, as economists say. But again, it's done through the markets. Now, you can see that profitability is very low. Never before have profits been so low in capitalism. Some of them never have made a profit. Take Airbnb, take Uber, take Netflix. They have never made a profit. Even Tesla, very successful company by Elon Musk. Losses, losses, losses, tiny profits now, tiny profits. But their valuation, their wealth is going through the roof in the stock exchange, through the roof. And why is that happening? Because central banks since 2008, since the refloating of the banks that collapsed in 2008, they've been printing money. So it's central bank money which is keeping capitalism afloat. It's not private profit. It's state money. That's a big transformation. That has never happened in the last 200 years. And then the second thing that has happened is that now we have a replacement of markets with platforms. So when you go into Amazon as a consumer or a producer trying to sell your stuff in Amazon, you're producing what, little gadgets, and you want to sell them through Amazon because how else do you sell things today? There's one person, Jeff Bezos, who owns the space, the whole space. It's like somebody owning the whole town, the digital town called Amazon. It's owned by one person. So what you and I as consumers see, let alone buy, is controlled by one person. It's like walking in Istanbul and finding out that Istanbul belongs to one person and every shop is owned by one person. Everything that you can buy or sell has to go through this to that one person. That's not a monopolist. That's a feudal lord. That's pre-capitalist. And it's digital. So it's techno-feudalism with state money. Which means that most exploitation now moves beyond the relationship between the capitalist and the proletariat. So the proletariat is shrinking, the precariat is rising. You and me are producing, all of you, especially younger people, are producing capital for the big platform companies simply by posting things on Facebook. That's capital for Facebook. So you're creating for free their capital and you're getting nothing. That's a kind of exploitation that Marx never talked about because it wasn't around. So exploitation now is extra market. It's feudal again, but turbocharged with technology. The left, concentrating on the right of people who have a puny waged job, is becoming increasingly relevant for this. Unless we embrace this new reality of what I call techno-feudalism, and we create a broad alliance of people who are exploited in a variety of ways by platforms, by the power of central bank money, by the power of big banks, by the power of big tech and big pharma, it will fail.
So let me steer the conversation towards what we have been experiencing. As you know, we have had a trust director for more than 5 months now, and we have been trying to protest in various ways. We have been trying to reach people that are necessarily not in our side in this debate, and people who are perhaps indifferent to participate, and we have been trying to reach them as well. So how can we students try to make something that is bigger than ourselves and perhaps surpasses the university barrier and tries to reach the entirety of the population in a way that transforms political change? How can we reach people? How can we, as students, create change in this non-democratic society?
Invest in curiosity. I mean that, right? There's nothing more revolutionary than curiosity. The one thing that radicalizes people is when they realize that the world doesn't make sense. According to it doesn't make sense if they use the information they're being given by the establishment, by the media, by their professors, by the people they speak to on the street. Then when they say, hang on a second, something is happening to me. My life is problematic in a variety of ways. Why? What's going on? And especially if you point out huge paradoxes. Paradox feeds curiosity, and curiosity feeds evolutionary movements. So let me give you an example. If you say to people, look, I understand why in Sierra Leone people are poor, why investment is low. Because in Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, there are very few savings. Together, the population has very little money saved to invest. So they are simply reproducing a hand-to-mouth life. But we here in the West, and you too in Turkey, that's not true. We never had so much money before. If you look at the amount of money in our financial systems, we never had so much as we do now. And yet investment is very low. Why is this happening? Because it's a gross failure. It's one thing not to have any money and therefore you're not investing and you remain poor. It's quite another to have a glut of savings. Never before has the earth, the planet, humanity had so many savings. We have something like 30% of global income is being saved. Humanity never managed to save anything like that. And yet investment is very low relative to the amount of money we have. So this is, it's a conversation opener. You say, well, what are the media telling you about this? They're not even telling you that this is the case. And numbers help to wake people up. Say, look, we have a pandemic, right? We have a real need to vaccinate the world. The International Monetary Fund has reported 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. They've done a study. I don't know how accurate it is, but even if it's not very accurate, you can get a ballpark number of what it would cost to vaccinate twice every human being on this planet, and came to $39 billion. Sounds like a huge amount of money. Well, until you ask yourself the question, how much did the central banks of the G7, only the G7, I don't count Turkey or Greece in this, only the G7, how much money did the central banks print to give to the bankers? 9,000 billion. During the pandemic, March 2020 to now, 9,000 billion. It would take only 39 to vaccinate the world. Well, if you print 9,000, why don't you print 9,039 and vaccinate the world? Do you see what I mean? Because you need conversation openers in order for people to overcome the belief which is stopping people from acting. The belief that, yes, the world sucks, the world is terrible, but it is the best possible world we could have, given the circumstances. Huh? You see, I don't know whether you remember or you ever read a revolutionary text by Voltaire called Candide, in which there is a character, it's a bit like a novel, and there's a character in Voltaire called Pangloss, who is the tutor of Candide. And he has this view, the Panglossian view, a precursor of Tina, that there is no alternative, right? And he says that we live in the best of all possible worlds. It may be a horrible world. I'm not saying that it's good, he says, but it is the best of all possible worlds. Now, if people internalize this, even if they're suffering massively, there will be no change. They will never be organized. But if you break this down by means of simple examples of giving you a company, you need to come up with your own, that highlights the fact that this is not the best of all possible worlds. With, by pressing a little button here and a little button there, without any great revolutionary change, right? Instead of printing 9,000, print 9,039. We're not asking for socialism. Just a few more numbers. It's, within the margin of error. If you try to print 9,000, it's very easy to make a mistake and print 9,039. And then suddenly the pandemic goes away. The moment people put this in their head, they think, hang on a second, this is not the best of all possible worlds. That's the beginning. That's the opening you need to start a movement.
So my final question, and perhaps you can make some concluding remarks, and perhaps if there are questions from the audience, we'll love to take them. So we have been talking about how to protest. We have been talking about how to reach people that are not necessarily on our side. You said we have to exploit these non-perfect things that we have in our world. What is your, let's say, practical utopia if Mayor 25 or in every country the DM party would come to power? What would you do first? What is your first 100-day plan? What's your practical utopia?
Well, I'm not sure that our audience cares very much about Greece because Greece is a small state. But in the European Union, I mean, I could answer about Greece, but I think it would be a little bit boring. So let me answer at the EU level. When the pandemic started, DM25 came up with a 3-point plan. 3 things that could happen within a week and make a tangible difference. Because you see, all you need to show is that you can make a tangible difference without any revolutionary change. And then revolutionary change becomes possible, if you know what I mean. Once people start evicting from their heads and minds and hearts, Pangloss and Tina, that there is no alternative, the Dixon. So the 3 policies we proposed, not that we expected them to be adopted, but we were trying to convince people that there are things that can be done differently within the existing system, this awful, horrible existing system. First thing was, instead of the central bank of Europe printing money to give to Siemens and Volkswagen, all these companies, through the private banks, because that's what happens. They print money, they give it to Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, the banks give it to Volkswagen, Alstom, Siemens. Those companies then don't invest because look around the place, they see poor people, suffering from the pandemic, from recession, from austerity and so on, and say, yeah, as if they would be able to buy expensive products from us. So what they do is they take this money printed by the central bank and they go to the stock exchange and they buy back their own shares. And the shares of Volkswagen go up, but there's no investment, no new jobs, nothing. So instead of doing that, we said, okay, why doesn't the ECB give 2,000 euros to every European? Flat, a universal basic dividend as a help, aid during the pandemic, because then they will go out and buy stuff, or they buy stuff through the internet. That's a far more effective way of refloating the economy during the pandemic. And also, it's absolutely legal, because there is no impediment in the charter of the European Central Bank to doing that. What they can't do is print money and give it to our states, but they can give it to citizens. It's not banned in any way. So that's one thing: universal basic dividend paid by the central bank. I mean, others have done it. Even Donald Trump did it. They sent a check to every American, and then Joe Biden repeated it. The Hong Kong central bank did it. We're not even asking for something that has never been done. So that's one. 2, we need investment in the green transition. Serious investment. We need something like 500 billion every year in order to move away from fossil fuels and have a green energy union in Europe. So how do you do that? Well, we have the European Investment Bank and we have the European Central Bank. Let the European Investment Bank issue bonds to the tune of 500 billion every year, and let the European Central Bank buy them. Instead of buying the bonds of, Siemens and so on and so forth, buy the bonds of the public investment fund, which can then take this money and create a green transport union. So we can have electrified trains in Eastern Europe, across Germany, which we still don't have. So that we can get rid of, gas supplies and replace them with wind power and the renewable energy union across Europe, which we don't have. Every country is doing its own thing very inefficiently and without even enough funding to do it. That's the second thing. We also suggested that vaccines can be purchased, as I said, by having the central bank purchase. So these are things that we could have done immediately and would have changed the atmosphere comprehensively and suddenly. And also a fiscal issue about debt, which is a bit boring, but the ways of alleviating the debt that now falls on the shoulders of our governments that cannot hold it. And the result of that is they're cutting down, or they will be cutting down as of next year, creating more austerity and more recession at a time when we should be recovering from the pandemic. These are things that we put out there, not because we believe that the rulers of the European Union will adopt them. They will not adopt them. They will prefer to die than adopt them. But what we want to do is that we want to tell people out there that, look, we could have a completely different Europe tomorrow if the political will was there to look after the majority, even with the existing rules. Because what really impedes the creation of social movements and democratic pressure is the feeling that the majority had, even people on the left, that, you know what, they couldn't do anything different within the existing rules. We want to point out that they could do things even within the existing rules in order to create the radicalization which is necessary amongst people who say, you could do it, why are you not doing it?
So one final question, because I think this will be really an illuminating thing to ask. What is DiEM25 doing? What is Merve doing in order to let these people know that there is an alternative to what we're experiencing right now? What is your practical solution to all this? Methodology, let me say, instead of solution.
Two things. A workable, convincing, technocratically astute, and simultaneously politically progressive program. We need to have answers to questions such, okay, so what would you do about this? What would you do about that? If you were in government tomorrow, what would you do? We need to be able to answer these questions. Saying no to what the establishment is doing is not enough. To back up your disobedience, you need a constructive plan. So that's one thing we do. And the second thing we try to do is organize. Organize and organize. It's hard work. You need to get out there and you need to speak to people in the neighborhoods. I just came back from northern Greece. I'm about to go to South Greece. We have Zooms every day because now, of course, still we have COVID-19 restrictions in Italy, in France, in the United Kingdom. We don't care that they're not in the EU anymore. In Germany, our people are organizing from town to town. So plan and organization.
So thank you, Professor Varoufakis, for your time. Perhaps we would enjoy some concluding remarks. And if there are some questions from the audience in the meantime, please feel free to write them in the chat and the professor will be able to see them directly.
I want to speak to your students just for a moment and to say that it is your duty as activists, as scholars, to pursue hard knowledge. Don't go for the easy stuff. There is a tendency amongst the youth to opt for the kind of disciplines which are easy on the eye and the ear, like cultural studies, but without going anywhere near the depth which is necessary. So study the hard questions. Go delve deeply into whether it's physics or anthropology or economics. Don't do what business courses do. An MBA is the worst enemy of humanity. An MBA, Masters in Business Administration, is what is destroying the mind of the young, because it gives you the sense that you're an expert on everything, with a little bit of accounting, a little bit of macroeconomics, a little bit of political science, a little bit of diplomacy. You learn nothing in any of those fields, and you end up with a safety in your mind that you're an expert on everything. You're a dangerous person. If you really want to be, an agent of change, you've got to go for the hardest kind of knowledge there is to attain.
Thank you, Professor. If there are no further questions, this was İktisat's first session of the series, The Story of the Other, where we will feature political activists, scholars, and the like, and try to learn from their experiences. Our first guest was the invaluable Professor Yanis Varoufakis, who shared with us his experiences in Europe, the DM25 movement, and Mera, and what have you. Professor, thank you for being here, and hope we can see you in better days to come.
I'm looking forward to seeing you in Boğaziçi.
Thank you.